Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm particularly greeting the guests here at the pavilion, IFAD Pavilion, Glasgow at the COP26. So it's a pleasure to have you here. And also good morning, good afternoon to our colleagues joining us virtually. So I am Ndaya Belchika. I am the lead technical specialist for gender and social inclusion at IFAD, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's session, which will look at the nexus between climate and gender. Before we get started, and while we wait for everyone to be organized, I will just go over a few tips. So for those participating in Zoom, you can send your questions through the Q&A box on the chat. For those participating live here, you are invited to send your question through the VBox apps. You will see that when the time comes. There will be translation services in French, English, and international language. So please feel free to tune to the regular channels. I don't remember which one that is, but I think it's 1, 2, and 3. And then you will see that the international language is there on your screen. The conversation today will have multiple parts. I'm frowning a little bit because they are loud announcements, so there we go. So the announcement is made because we're in the pavilion. But what I was saying is that today's event has multiple parts. First, we will have opening remarks by 2 distinguished guests. We're gonna have Dr. Joe Puri, who's the Assistant Vice President of the Strategy Knowledge Department at IFAD, followed by Mr. Peter McDougall, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister for Global Issues and Development and Governor of Canada at IFAD. Following that, we will have a panel discussion, and that panel discussion will be enriched with a couple of videos that will bring the voice from the field. So we will have a video from Guatemala, and then during that conversation, we will have another video from Ethiopia. So what I would like to do is that today's discussion is an important one to have for a number of reasons. We are going to be discussing the issues of gender inequality in the context of climate change for a number of reasons. So first of all, gender equality is both a driver and a consequence of exposure of climate risk. Second, when we look at the impact that women do have, they are at the forefront of climate change, and yet they do not have the power to make important decisions. Not only do they not have the power to make decisions, but they are also substantially underrepresented in the different bodies where they could make their voice heard. In addition to that, many of them do lack the technicity or the capacity to make some changes, but at the same time, in many cases, they are also perceived as victims. Well, we discount in doing so that they are, in actuality, powerful agent of change. So today's discussion will actually look at some concrete solutions where we can build the capacity of women, focusing on the adaptive capacities while contributing to respond to some of the challenges linked to climate change. And without further ado, so I would like to invite Dr. Joe Puri with her opening remarks. Joe, the floor is yours.
Here today. Can you hear me? Yeah. Such a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm really delighted to be here today talking not just about what we can do and what we are doing in terms of gender inequality and what IFAD is doing, but also focusing on some of the challenges and the opportunities for us as we go forward. And I do want to stress one thing, because I've been hearing a lot at COP about what we need to commit to. I've been hearing also a lot about what our commitments are. But I have to say that for us to be credible, for us to actually know that this is working and to make credible promises, we need to see roadmaps, we need to see targets, and we need to see investments. And this is really key, and this is my clarion call out to everyone who's watching, that if you care about gender inequality and if you care about women's empowerment, then let's put our money where our mouth is. IFAD has been at the forefront of thinking about gender inequality since its inception. With Nadaya's leadership and the leadership of a very, very strong gender team at IFAD, who I'm very proud to be part of as well. I think what we are seeing is that we have been working not just on defining investments in the space of gender and improving gender inequality, but we are also seeing much better data, and we are also seeing much better evidence on what works and what doesn't. One of the key things amongst the rural poor that IFAD focuses on is really getting them to be financially included within the overall market economies that we are targeting. So, for example, 70% of IFAD's investments are focused on building, creating as well as building market economies and what are called productive investments. But guess what? Even as we provide women with bank accounts, 50% of the world's bank account holders are women. A disproportionate number of them, and this is more than 50% of those women, actually have zero balance savings accounts. What that means is that a lot of these women don't use their bank accounts to really take loans, be part of market economies, or really improve their own assets. They spend it on what is called consumption, expenditure, without improving their long-term ability to build their own resilience. This is one gendered impact of development that I think we've got to recognize, and just another example of what we've got to recognize when we are thinking about development and when we are talking about climate. That it is important to recognize the gendered impacts of most of our interventions and investments on the ground. Women are 4 times as likely compared to men to perish as a consequence of a climate shock. This was found by WHO. What does that mean? That means that we've got to start thinking about impacts of climate shocks for both men and women in differentiated ways. In a very different study that was done in the Philippines, looking at the impacts of typhoons, guess what one of the studies found? They found that that mortality rates of girl children spiked 1 year after a typhoon occurs. Why is that occurring? It's because after there is a climate shock, the intra-household food and consumption patterns change dramatically, with far more focus on boy children compared to girl children. Yeah, and that ignorance of girls' nutrition patterns essentially leads to a far greater increase in their mortality over what you would have seen anyway, so over the counterfactual, a year later. If we didn't have the data sets to see as to what was happening a year later, but also if we didn't have the data sets to understand what is the gendered impact and differentiate between girls and boys, we wouldn't know this. One of the key things that, for example, IFAD is doing is that it has adopted the ProVia indicators, which when we are targeting both gendered impacts, but also gender transformation. So one part of our overall investments are looking at mainstreaming or integrating impact on gender across our portfolio. Well, at least 50% of our portfolio. But the other part is really making a difference in terms of transforming the context within which our investments are taking place. And that's really looking to recognize that we focus on not just income and empowering women through access to income and assets, but also giving them a voice and recognizing their agency, and also recognizing that development itself might be posing an additional burden on them. So ensuring that workloads and work burdens are still equitably distributed as we go along is a really key part of what we examine as we invest in rural areas. With that, Nadaya, back to you.
So much, Joe. You actually raised the bar. because you did mention how important it is to have a roadmap, to actually invest more, and to have the evidence of what is required, and then to actually track the gender differences, the gender impact. So with this, I would like to invite Mr. Peter McDougall. Thank you so much. I could hear the echo. Peter McDougall, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Global Issues and Development and Governor of Canada at IFAD. Mr. McDougall, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Really great to be with everyone, even from a distance. I'm also pleased to be here on behalf of Canada's new Minister of International Development, Harjit Sajjan, who could not join us today. It's really my honor to deliver the opening remarks along with Joe about rural women at the forefront of climate resilience. And certainly there are no better hosts for such an event than IFAD and its partner, the Canadian Food Grains Bank. Canada greatly values these two organizations, and you both play a crucial role with smallholder farmers on the front lines of the climate crisis. Smallholder farmers face the very real and immediate impacts of climate change: water scarcity, loss of land, pressure on pastures, disruption of traditional lifestyles, and threats to livelihoods. Everyone, everywhere is affected by climate change. In Canada, last summer, wildfires in British Columbia destroyed an entire town, and melting sea ice continues to threaten communities across the north. But worldwide, it's the poorest and most vulnerable people who suffer the most from the climate-related crisis. We cannot afford to move from one crisis to another. We need long-term solutions, and these solutions must involve women. We cannot build sustainable and secure climate-resilient food systems when women, who make up more than 40% of the global agricultural labor force, these women own less than 20% of the land, and when smallholder farmers receive less than 2% of climate finance worldwide. To build climate security and resilience, we need to tackle gender equality head-on, including the fact that women bear a disproportionate burden of work on family farms. I know that IFAD intends to double its impact over the next 10 years, and pleased to see you working with partners like the Canadian Food Grains Bank to promote gender rights and equality. We're also pleased that IFAD is making Indigenous peoples a priority group for its programs. We know that Indigenous peoples have deep knowledge of climate security and resilience, biodiversity conservation, and knowledge on how to preserve the land while still ensuring a robust food supply. If we are to transform our food systems to address climate change, we simply must include the voices of Indigenous peoples, smallholder farmers, women, and rural leaders. Reaching these communities to harness their extensive experience and knowledge of the land requires important partnerships with civil society organizations. Some examples of IFAD and Canadian civil society partnerships include working with smallholder farmers to scale up conservation agriculture in East Africa, and tackling COVID-related food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa. These projects are improving lives, livelihoods, and land access, particularly for vulnerable women. The on-air food systems dialogues facilitated by Farm Radio International, IFAD, and World Vision are another great example of how we can amplify the voices of local communities and smallholder farmers. Canada looks forward to continuing our work with IFAD, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and other partners to achieve a low-carbon, food-secure, and climate-resilient future for us all, but especially for those working on the forefront, rural women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. McDougall, for your introduction, your opening remarks, because as we know, Canada is a particular partner of IFAD. We do recognize the partnership because we do have the same priorities. As you did mention, the priorities and the focus on small-scale farmers, including women, indigenous people, to make sure that whatever effort is made is actually fully inclusive. And with this, I would like to invite you to look at a video from Guatemala that will bring us some voice from the field. This is a virtual journey just to understand some of the situation in Guatemala. Please take a listen.
In the highlands of northern Guatemala, tropical cloud forests, rich in biodiversity, act like sponges, absorbing rainwater and releasing it slowly into the ground, recharging the springs. For thousands of years, this fragile ecosystem has sustained the Quechua population, the largest indigenous group in Guatemala and direct descendants of the Mayans. But now this Quechua community is feeling the effects of deforestation and climate change. In recent years, 24-year-old Irma Kakul has watched her surroundings transform. Increased agriculture, illegal logging and fires have reduced forest cover. This has been compounded by a change in rainfall patterns. Guatemala is particularly vulnerable to climate change, and as temperatures rise and unpredictable bursts of rainfall wash away the soil, farmers like Irma are struggling to grow as much as they used to.
Llueve, digamos, quizá la misma cantidad de lluvia durante el año, pero en temporadas cortas, y eso afecta mucho la erosión, inundaciones, y la población pues se ha visto afectada concretamente en sus cultivos.
With floods and landslides becoming more frequent, protecting the livelihood of these communities has become urgent. A project called Pro de Norte has set up tree nurseries in 19 municipalities. Supported by the UN's International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, they plan to reforest 400 hectares by 2020. Irma is planting trees around the community vegetable garden to protect it from soil erosion and provide shade to shield their crops from the heat. In the long term, this should result in an increase in yields, but the women here needed a more immediate solution to increase their incomes. So they have started cooking. Irma has joined 260 other indigenous women who are now attending cooking classes. They are learning how to turn their crops into nourishing foods, which command higher prices. Irma's group sell these freshly made snacks to workers at the local town hall during their lunch break. To help these women plan for their future and that of their children, 200 savings groups have been established in villages across the region. With training provided by the project team, Irma chairs her group at her home. Each member's earnings are meticulously recorded, and these women are learning how to manage their money. Irma is one of 42,000 indigenous people who are now acquiring new skills and practices which make them less vulnerable to the changing environment and allow them to invest in their future.
So as you could see, so this is a very good example in Guatemala where in response to shocks, indigenous communities have demonstrated that they are agents of change, that they can actually be creative and innovative with new solutions to develop their livelihood. Before we go into the panel discussion, I will give the floor back to Joe, Dr. Joe Puri. You have the floor.
It's essentially to recognize a quick erratum in one of the figures that I cited. So I said that women and children are 4 times as likely as men to perish as a consequence of a climate change event like a typhoon or a disaster. Guess what? The number is 14 times. 14 times more likely to perish as a consequence of a climate change event. And I think this is one of the bigger reasons as to why we need to look at the intersection of climate and women. Thanks very much for that, Nadaya, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. So now we're going to be transitioning to the panel discussion. But before we do so, I will take a moment to introduce our distinguished guests. So the first one is Winnie Mutinda. She's the Public Policy Advisor on Climate Change at the Canadian Food Grain Bank, a network of organizations working to end global hunger. Our next panelist is Mr. Satya Tripathi, who's going to be joining us virtually. He's the Secretary General at the Global Alliance on the Sustainable Planet. He served at the UN in a number of capacities, and most recently was the UN Assistant Secretary General, head of the New York office at UN Environment, and Secretary of the UN Environment Managing Group. And then we're going to have Maria Fernanda Espinosa. Ms. Espinosa has held many senior leadership positions within the government of Ecuador. She has held many ministerial positions. In addition to that, Ms. Espinosa served as the president of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. She was the 4th woman in history and the first woman from Latin America and the Caribbean to hold this position. It is quite an achievement. So now we're going to transition to the discussion. We have seen and then we have heard that gender inequality is both a driver and a consequence of exposure of climate risk and disaster. We've known also that despite the fact that they are highly susceptible to climate change, they don't necessarily have the resources or the voice to be fully represented in the different bodies that actually discuss what are some of the actions in response to climate change. The first question that I have for our 3 panelists, and I would ask first Maria for you to come with an answer. What are some of the game-changing solutions to shift the trajectory of climate change impacts, particularly when we know that they have devastating impact on women and girls and other vulnerable communities? Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nadaya, and thank you to IFAD for celebrating together this Gender Day at COP26. I think the best tribute should be a tribute to rural and indigenous women that, they teach us every day what climate resilience means, what traditional knowledge and practices mean, that they feed us every day. So my tribute to indigenous and rural women worldwide in this Gender Day. And just to go directly to your question, and Nadaya, I would say 3 things, but one word perhaps, power. Power is the word here. We need more women, especially rural and indigenous women, at the decision-making table. They need, they are rights holders, and it's power sharing, full participation in decision-making, especially on climate decision-making, investment, proper investment. We have heard the previous panelists, the opening words, very wise opening words from the Canadian government saying, yes, climate change, as any other crisis, what it does, it magnifies inequalities. And we know that the most vulnerable sectors of society are the ones that suffer the most. In the case of rural women, because they don't have access to land, they don't own the land, because there's a huge gap of unpaid care work in rural areas, because violence against women and against rural women, because lack of access to financial services, etc. So what are the 3 key issues that I think are critical? First of all, power sharing, having rural women, indigenous women at the table, and not as tokens, but as agents of change, as knowledge providers as providers of wisdom, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the number one. The number two is a change in the narrative. Yes, women are victims in a disproportionate way of the impacts of climate change, especially rural and indigenous women. But rural and indigenous women are also agents of transformation, agents of knowledge, agents of wisdom. So this changing narrative from victims to rights holders is critical. So the second thing is I think that they need to be at the climate negotiations. They should have a voice, not in the side corridors, not in a small room, but they have to be part and parcel when countries are preparing their NDCs, when they're doing their planning, when they're deciding on the proper ecological transition on energy. Women have to be at the table, especially rural women. And the number three, and the third aspect and issue, Nadaya, is investment. We are speaking about building back better, building forward better. So many pledges, billions of dollars being pledged, which is fine, but we need to make sure that investment in recovery of the pandemic recovery processes are not gender neutral. They're gender sensitive and especially sensitive towards the needs and rights of rural and indigenous women. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. You actually did share a lot of points. You know, I don't know how many of you from the audience had a chance to take a look at the cartoon in the hallway, because I saw it's very beautiful. So you should go and take a look, because you mentioned, Maria, the power, and there is a very nice illustration of the power, the power play between the global south and the global north. A good illustration showing where there is no such a thing as a win-win. Well, we would like to believe so, but then the way it's perceived, it's like it's a win-lose, and therefore it's very difficult to share power. Well, for us, when we are discussing about inclusion, gender equality, we are looking at win-win solutions where the power is shared with all stakeholders. That's number one. You did also mention the representation, and I only have the figure of 2018, where we know that only 40% of women were actually part of the party delegates. And they only were represented at 30% in the negotiations. I'm not sure of the figure nowadays, but what I heard from yesterday's conversation is that indigenous people only were about no more than 50 out of the 20,000 delegates. So when we talk about inclusion, of course, there need to be fair representation for the negotiations. So, Mweni, I would like to hear your perspective to the same questions. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the question, and to answer, allow me to set the scene. First, I am honored to be here, and it is my purpose and hope today during this conversation to prioritize voices that are rarely heard, voices that, for obvious reasons, as you mentioned, cannot be speaking here for themselves. Millions of small-scale farmers, mostly women in developing countries, but particularly in small island developing states and least developed countries, are on the front lines of this global climate emergency. Having met and worked with hundreds of women farmers, listening and sharing a meal together, it is clear their rural livelihoods options continue to diminish with every compounding shock, significantly undermining the incremental gains they attain. We know that women and girls who have secure livelihoods, access to education and information on climate change impacts, healthcare facilities, fresh water, sanitation, and social support will fare better in the face of climate change. We know the current food system works poorly for most of the world's population. It fails to provide affordable, nutritious diets within planetary boundaries for them. The pandemic has further exposed the vulnerabilities of this global food system. The level and severity of vulnerabilities are personal, and yet each one of us is deeply interconnected to each other and to our world. Committing to collectively develop climate resilient food systems that are equitable, foster and sustain transformational change means recognizing and working to safeguard our shared humanity. So just to get to what it is, the way we work matters. The process used is a game-changing solution, a process that centers local communities and contexts, that considers specific environmental, social, cultural, economic, and historical impacts, particularly for women and girls in most vulnerable communities, matters. This is the process is what's needed to shift the trajectory of climate impacts. A systems approach to building climate resilience is a pathway to prioritize and support contextualized solutions that enable small-scale farm producers to adapt to climate change impacts. Canadian Food Grains Bank recently led an extremely successful 5-year Scaling Up Conservation Agriculture program from 2015 to 2020, which trained farmers and engaged with policymakers and other stakeholders. This jointly funded program between Canadian Global Affairs Canada and Canadian Food Grains Bank had the goal to strengthen the food security status and diversify the livelihoods of 50,000 small-scale farmers in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. This program, in fact, exceeded this goal, and here are some factors and opportunities to further scale successes and learning. One, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and I'm so glad that Deputy Minister McDougall mentioned partnerships, and we welcome that. So government, across government, academic and research institutions, private sector, everybody needs to be at the table. Number two, technical training on conservation agriculture, building on Indigenous knowledge and good agronomic practices. Number three, knowledge exchange and learning spaces, on-farm experimentation, farmer field schools, and having farmers at the center to lead those processes. Number four, working with local community-based organizations to identify and address gender inequality blind spots. And finally, number five, examples of overall successes. Through this 5-year program, we saw increased sense of confidence, agency, respect within community, and all of these social, intangible results were self-reported by women. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I like the way you actually brought back some of the facts that are very sobering, but then you provided some very concrete solution that sort of mirror what Maria have said, right? I mean, when you talk about sharing the power, it's multi-stakeholder representation. You talk about leveraging the skill set. So it's also recognized that women, Indigenous people, girls, even men, they're all empowered. You know and they have some solution that they can contribute. The capacities can be built as well. So I can see that there is some recurring themes here. And what I would like to do is to invite Mr. Tripathi to provide the perspective from his point of view. Satya, the floor is yours. We cannot hear. Satya, we cannot hear. We cannot hear you. No sound. You are muted locally. If you can please unmute yourself. Can you check your settings, please? Okay, so what I suggest is that we go to the video for Ethiopia while we check the set, and then when we are back, Mr. Tripathi will join us. The video for
Tasunta asnaqech zema geetettes hashu saro yideta tataketta intena bessana. Taasi naati hospun naati des awara betisabe tamma kumes. Hageeti tanata. Tanati timirte keetta bosona. Kanati ciao ciao. Nuka shoka be ana. Hai. Muzi akatokas. Agesi papaya baizada misha takametta isnatu timirte ke tawda utara shammais. Ekaba irsha tani tamarasi ekaba irsha. Gadiya tikkiyoga geetettes. Woy shooqa tikkiyoga geetettes. Badala kaagan zerada ekkaas shukkaariya ka qassi endegana tokkaas. Hachi oyddu laytta qaqi qaba irsha. Timirtiya baada timirtiya tamarada ekkada doommas.
Baada tamaardara ayyo. Ta tamara bekke. A tamardogan ayin betam boras macarasha boriya boras. Haga tai kehi ichasha isupuna zarada goyin mirte tawmi benashin ha yaga otin taw mirte mane ademidoga beda tanka umudetada indegana ya tanka madiyuga ega geligida koyru betam kehi goyido gode lo okatta minjidi daro katta son layta fe layta gatidi tirpiyuga tose otisuga domigis
Metwa ugaso gidia ba aibe gidi nu hewodian ka oichini. Metwa ugaso gidio ge tati mirte ekido gadan inte ekanagi ko metwa ugaso bitase gidia ge. Facebook ya kancan kata minja misha otidi. Wote yoga kono imen naton. Kata minjos. Tayo de oy bujetti doge tametoy shempi doge tanati namsette nammi doge kallidi tanatu shayay qassi lo iyaga asanatu amotenna lo iya chama wotti doge lo iya mayo mai doge timirti ka aggidoga daraja qayya guji qatalidi tamari doge taw daro baysiyeti tana upaysiya baydis o bonchos ma yaineti usaga kido gisho tana kehippe ufaytais qatimirti ahida asaka goda donan anjais sintoka ka minta ekanasi godigiko osi wolqa gidinta polwaga kanashi agike gede caqo gela utasi hachi go misha oledi wonto ga namsetto pite kammite aga bete tanka ottada kallasi ottada ekkasi co ugedi utin betenna metetenna beni gadan boray goyin awa wolqay wurin natu wolqay wurin managi ko mizi benna laytay hagadan bita bonchidi bita mazidi kammidi mite yaga tamarsais
So Moini, could you provide a little bit of the context for this project? Just a few minutes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Sure.
So this is a very short illustration and demonstration of what happened on the ground through the 5-year Scaling Up Conservation Agriculture Program in East Africa. This woman, Asnakesh Zema, is a small-scale farmer in southern Ethiopia. And what you saw was a part of a 7-minute video where she is sharing how participating in this program not only resulted in increased food security within our household, diversified livelihoods, but also social cohesion within our home and within the community. And there are hundreds of and thousands of stories like that, because this program actually reached and exceeded the 50,000 goal of small-scale farmers. And what we've seen is that over the years, the level of scale is not only limited to within the plot, small plots of land that small-scale farmers have, but they're expanding to other pieces of land. And we have farmers who have seen the results from the ones that we're practicing and are coming on to practice and continuing for multiple seasons.
Excellent. So these are the type of solutions that we should consider, for which we could consider investing substantially, given that we are talking about conservation agriculture, which is really adaptation. So I see that Satya is back. So Satya, the question for you, what would be some of the game-changing solutions? We are well aware of some of the challenges, but we are interested to hear your point of view. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ndaya, and thank you for having me. Apologies for not being physically at the venue because I just thought that I didn't want to lose the opportunity in a cab between the venue I was at and getting to the blue zone. So apologies. Let me put it this way. It's not a win-lose thing. It's win-lose is the mindset of a bunch of people that for whom it is not enough that they win, but it is also important that others lose, because that's perhaps in a very strange way makes them happier. We can actually have win-win or what is called the triple bottom line for people, planet, and profit as well. And we have just launched here in the presence of 200 world leaders from government, civil society, business, something called carbon negative food systems. And we had the Second Lady of Kenya, the Environment Minister of Congo, and numerous other ministers from different African countries in the conversation. And what is coming out very clearly is that women have to be at the forefront of this battle. Not because, equity is sometimes presented as a binary. It is not a binary, because climate problem, climate change, climate breakdown, from my perspective, is man-made, because women never had a seat at the table. All these decisions have been made by men all along. And then now that we are in a serious crisis, and of course, women need to be at the negotiating table, and that must happen. This is not an either-or suggestion I'm making. That must happen, and that's crucial. But it is also important to realize that women have the resilience, women have the patience, women have the creativity, the innovation, and the imagination to actually help all of humanity. Let me share an example from a path-breaking idea that I have been supporting for 5 years now, something that is happening in the Andhra Pradesh state of India, where women farmers are actually changing the paradigm in ways never thought of before. It is already the world's largest farmer-to-farmer regenerative agriculture program, where input costs have dropped anywhere between 50 to 80% because they don't use synthetic chemical fertilizers or pesticides. They use natural bioinoculants like cow dung, cow urine, and 200 other biosubstances that can be used as fermenting agents or sterilizing agents. And the kind of improvements in soil chemistry to soil biology we have seen, the switch from chemistry to biology, which is what forests are the best living examples of. Nobody has put a pinch of fertilizer in a forest, but forests are the most vibrant ecosystems anywhere on the planet. That is because humans haven't happened to the forests. And so once our agriculture turns to regenerative and sustainable in a closed loop system where you don't disturb the harmony of nature, but you draw from it within a regenerative threshold, then we can actually find the results. And a lot of leaders have been talking about where is the mitigation going to come from? Because if everybody promises net zero by 20 this and 20 that, you're never going to have that, because everybody is thinking, I'll get some of it by avoiding emissions and some of it by offsets. There are no offsets. The only offsets you can get is by improving soil fertility, improving soil moisture, improving soil carbon. Soils can hold 3 times as much carbon as is in the atmosphere. That solution is really staring us on the face, and that's anchored on equity, anchored on prosperity for people at the grassroots, especially women who are the keepers and makers of the family system that we have all over the world. So I strongly feel the solutions are there. We just need to be brave enough to embrace these solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satya. Since you have the mic, how can some of those solutions be scaled up concretely? In less than 2 minutes, please.
Absolutely. So it can be scaled up by building virtuous partnerships, like the one we announced today, a $310 million investment in Jamaica in a carbon negative food system. And I would love to, after this, share it with all IFAD colleagues as to the way we have done it, and it is rather simple, it's not rocket science. We have taken 1,000 acres of land, and I'm just using that as a comparative scale. Take 1,000 acres of land, do a closed loop, intensive agriculture in 100 acres, leave 900 acres as a carbon sink. And then it's a carbon negative food system because everything is happening in one place and it's not one at the cost of the other. You have 9 times the forest for 1 times the land you're using for agriculture. And then it all works out fine. And even the investors, you'll be surprised how quickly we managed to get the funding for this. Because the investors see this as a rare opportunity. And we had literally the CEOs of numerous companies, I can talk world-leading companies, in the room today. And they all kept talking about how do we take it to other parts of the world. And that's what we need to do. And just to give you a comparative example, in a very productive land, let's say you're growing tomatoes. You normally would grow 10 tons of tomatoes in an acre. This system will grow 250 tons of tomatoes, 25 times. So that's the kind of greenhouse, aquaponic, hydroponic, aeroponic. It's a combination of technology and partnership. I think that's what will win us the day.
Thank you so much. Maria, I would like to bring you in for your perspective on how can some of those solutions be scaled up.
Well, Nadaya, I think that it is about technology, of course, but it is about the right policies and the right budgeting at the national level. And I think that the regional responses are extremely important, multilateral regional responses for wise policy, wise investment, gender sensitive, especially under the umbrella of the opportunity of building forward better. And here, I want to be very clear. We have heard so many announcements and pledges on the billions and the 100 billion and a Green Climate Fund. It is absolutely necessary that we invest equally in mitigation and in adaptation and resilience building. So I think that the connection between climate finance and climate investment and the fight against poverty, against inequalities, particular gender inequality, is absolutely critical. And the best way to go from a very local experience to the higher levels of government decision, but also to multilateral decision, is ensuring that the voices of local communities, of women leaders of the rural areas, indigenous women, have a space, a seat at the decision-making table. That's the best way. And one of the disconnections in climate negotiations is this, really top-down approach, or just a very localized experiences. Success stories have, to have the opportunity to scale up. It's a combination between bottom-up and top-down with the full participation of women, and in particular, women from the rural communities and indigenous women. That's what I would say, Nadaya. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. So, Moini, from your perspective, now we see some solutions. We have discussed how they could be scaled up, not in an exclusive manner or inclusive manner, but we have discussed that a little bit. What would be the policy implications of that, to make it happen?
Sure, thank you. And I think what I'm going to say resonates actually with my colleagues in terms of those kind of partnerships that are cross-sectoral and multi partnerships. That's central. So for farmers like Asnikech, this is not theory. This is not a matter of conversation or debate. This is now. We have to find solutions now, policy solutions that are actionable, that translate into the kind of action that she needs, farmers like her need. So one, delivery of climate finance. We've been talking about this. We've been having conversations on this for 30 years. And a colleague was saying earlier today that even 6 years ago, 8 years ago, it was still urgent at that time. So at what time is now? Now has to be now, not in 2 years as we've heard floated here. And that delivery is of the 100 billion USD that was agreed, but also to acknowledge that that's no longer sufficient. We need way more than that. When you look at farmers like Asnikech and others in Guatemala, the kind of things that they're dealing with as on the front lines. Just to say that the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was here early last week with the World Leader Summit, and one of the things he talked about actually is a follow-up on the recent doubling of Canada's climate finance. Earlier this summer, we heard that 5.3 billion going toward Canada's international climate finance. Of that, Canada will be allocating towards adaptation fund, and it's a first for Canada. So Canadian civil society and others are interested and keen to follow how the modality for that rollout is going to shape up, and whether it's in the interests and priorities of farmers in the Global South. Prioritizing the needs and preferences of small-scale farm producers. This is I don't need to say any more on that. Increasing grants to a minimum of 50%. Small-scale farmers like Asnikech should not be saddled with debt that they had nothing, they did not create that. So it's a matter of climate justice that those who are the worst emitters, the high emitters, need to pay for the losses and damages that small-scale farmers in the Global South are experiencing. Prioritizing the most vulnerable countries and people. I don't know why there seems to be a debate on this. Least developed countries, small island developing states. It's quite clear to me. And collaborating across sectors and actors. We go back again. We need everyone at the table, and not just at the table, but actually co-creating the recipe or the processes and procedures and policies for how we do this, so that we can come up with actionable solutions that work for all of us. And that is possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Winnie. I mean, you did hit a point here when you say the co-creation, we have to work together. And that has some very important policy implication there, because we all need to be at the table without power struggles, but really collegially decide and then look at localized solutions. But then if we are sitting at the table talking about some of the challenges, then we can come up with some solutions that can be scaled up, although the issue may be contextualized. Now, you did also mention that Canada made a commitment to double its climate finance. And the question that I have now is, for multilateral agency like IFAD, how could IFAD as an institution operationalize the support or the financial commitment made by partners such as Canada? Over to you, Winnie. Since you have the floor, you can continue.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I think building on the partnerships that we have, and as you said, I'm glad that you highlighted the whole idea about contextualized solutions, because the solutions that work for you may not work for me. And yet there's a space where we can come to an understanding about that. So one of the things that we learned through the Scaling Up Conservation Agriculture Program, which is, it was a massive program for a network of organizations like Canadian Food Grains Bank, where we had to learn to work together, to break down silos, to create new ways of working, to be intentional about sharing information and facilitating learning and sharing spaces with farmers, with private sector, government in all these countries. It was a lot of energy. It took a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of work to get us to the kind of solutions that we demand. This past weekend, we saw marches that brought out 100,000 people in the streets of Glasgow. What is that action about? That's about that we need to be paying attention to these issues and calling and amplifying the voices who are not here, who should be here. But as we say, this proverbial table, you know, I'm not even sitting at it because I'm not a negotiator. So I can't even bring these conversations to engage those who are in those spaces that are closed off. So I think for organizations like IFAD and Canadian Food Grains Bank, there is a call and an opportunity to work together to continue to center the small-scale farmers, the women and girls and men on the front lines that we know are facing losses and damages that they have no way of doing that, and they need to continue to adapt. Actually, they've been adapting for years, and they have the resilience and the agency for determining their own solutions. So it's really about creating the space where they let us know what they need, and then we come and support through partnerships and mobilization of finance and all kinds of other resources. Capacity, that capacity is actually on the ground. So it's about how do we support their agency to identify and pursue the solutions that work for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Moini. You're actually humbling us, right? Because we are here representing the 1.7 billion of women and rural women and girls, but yet they are not here, right? So they are not here, they are not necessarily at the negotiation table, but we want to believe that we are there to raise their voice. So yes, we also have a responsibility to continue to push that flag. So thank you for humbling all of us, but we all join here. Maria, I would like to bring you in. For your perspective, what would be the role that in an institution such as IFAD can play, particularly as it uses some of the climate finance to address the gender equality issues? Over to you.
Well, Nadaya, I think that the experience you have, you know, the lasting and sustained experience in local solutions, in working with women at the ground and innovation at the ground, I think that the need to have like a clearinghouse for a South-South experience exchange would be wonderful. A place where you can add local power and transform it into a global transformative power and a global transformative voice. I think that that's the way to connect the dots, to work from the local to the local community level, to the local government level, but you know, to have the world map. And innovation at the ground, innovation in rural areas by rural women is not only happening in the global south, it is also happening in the global north. The geography of poverty, the resilient in carbon-friendly food systems, you can find them everywhere, and it would be great to have IFAD bring all this knowledge, this innovation together so they can inform decision-making at the national and international level. So it can inform, you know, negotiators as we speak at COP26, so they can sensitize finance ministers when they're making decisions about budgeting. So rural women are owners of their land, and they're not just victims of a system that is so unfair and unjust to them. So I think that there is a great role for IFAD on scaling up knowledge sharing, South-South cooperation, triangular cooperation of good practices. Really, it touches your heart looking at what is happening in Guatemala, my own region. And the Quechua indigenous women is one example. If you go to my country, to any country in the Amazon, in the 8 countries that share the Amazon basin, you would see and touch, you know, how much wisdom there is in adapting to climate change, in resilience building. And this needs to be shared, to be acknowledged, to be part and parcel of the decision-making, of the investment, of the budgeting. And I would say that, and really thank you for what IFAD has done for so many years. Back to you, Nadaya.
Thank you, Maria. So now I have a question for you, Satya, related to building on what Maria just said about the need to, at least the opportunity that IFAD has or any other multilateral organization to share knowledge, continue to create some exchanges between the South, the global South and the global North. For you, the question, what additional evidence is required to actually promote gender responsive climate investing? Because it seems that the evidence is there, or at least we know some of the facts, but yet it seems that there is some resistance in terms of investing. So from your perspective, what is required? What evidence would support additional investment in gender responsive climate investing? Over to you.
Well, I think for me, it's not a question of, I agree with everything Maria said, and I actually can report to all of you the evidence that I just showed. We presented on this carbon negative food systems template where we have organized a $300 million plus investment in Jamaica. And the Prime Minister was so pleased to see that this is happening in his country. But what is more interesting is that the moment the event got, we got off the stage and we were talking, I had about 20 very senior leaders, ministers, directors general, secretaries from countries from the global South, actually approaching and saying, how can we work together to make it happen in our respective countries or regions? So and this clearly bears out what Maria was saying, that there is great interest in learning from each other. But I think I would like to make the point, and this is a point I made to the Green Climate Fund CEO, Yannick Lemarek, who was also speaking at the event I was at just now, is that organizations like the Green Climate Fund, or for that matter, IFAD, of course, which has been around for way longer than the GCF has, have to start taking risks that you wouldn't consider normal, because we are not in normal times anymore. And risk, as we understand technically, is probability times impact. And as the probability of these damages to the ecological earth systems is accelerating, the impact will be much worse. So the resources we have to set aside a significant amount of that as risk capital, so that we try out new ideas. So if IFAD is deploying $1, and I was talking, of course, in the context of the GCF, it shouldn't be, or $1 million for that matter, it should be producing $100 million in impact, not $200,000, because 80% is wasted in bureaucratic administrative issues, as we know in the developing world. That's the bane of all of us people like myself and many others from the developing world, that most of the money that is deployed for development impact is lost in translation. And that is why we really need to step up. We need to look at catalytic opportunities by women, by young people that are really stepping up to the plate, and be the champion of taking catalytic risk. Because if we don't, then we are stuck in our old business as usual template that simply does not work anymore. And we will never have, and I make this point often, the global GDP is about 30% in the public sector and 70% in the private sector. So on that 30%, there are numerous demands from people, constituents, all kinds of pressure groups on governments to do this and that. And we somehow believe that the little bit of money that you can take out from that 30% can go around the world and make all the changes that we need at system scale. That's not going to happen. We really need to step up public finance and make sure it is deployed for public good. And that is possible by blended finance, as we know very popularly now, by innovative finance, by risk capital, by first loss capital. There are so many ways of squaring that circle, but the time to square that circle is now.
Thank you so much. And this is the perfect time to pivot actually to the question of finance, because we did hear quite eloquently that yes, global or climate finance is increasing. There is no question about it. I'm not saying that it's enough, but it's increasing. However, the percentage going to small scale producer is only 2%, very, very small. In addition to that, when we compare the funding for mitigation versus adaptation, we see that for every $18 of funding for mitigation, there is only $1 for adaptation. And then of course, there is also that dichotomy between all the funding going to the global north versus going to the global south. So the question that I have for all of you actually, is how can we, or what can be done for funding to actually go where it's needed the most? Whether we are talking about funding going to the global south, funding for small scale producers, or funding to go for women and girls in agriculture. What can be done concretely for the funding to be directed where it's needed most? Do you want to take it, please?
Well, yeah.
I can start, and my colleagues can come in. Thank you for that question. And I think that when country parties signed on to deliver 100 billion every year to least developing countries to address climate change vulnerabilities and issues, part of that journey, at least for civil society in Canada, has been to look at the way that funding is transferred, the way it's implemented matters. So it's not enough, and I think these are the shortfalls that you've mentioned. It's not enough that it goes through to mitigation and it's in the form of loans. It's not helping and reaching the women and men, small scale farm producers in least developed countries and small island developing states. It's not reaching them. What we want and what we are calling for, and in fact why I'm at COP26 this year, is draw attention to the fact that climate finance has to be delivered, and it has to be delivered now. We've been having this conversation, it has to be delivered. That's on the table. And this is actually reiterating calls from least developing countries, country parties that have been saying this. And second, at minimum, 50% of that delivery needs to be for adaptation. And minimum 50% needs to be in the form of grants, not loans. This is because when a farmer like Asnakech in southern Ethiopia, how do we expect her to pay back a loan? She has 8 kids and she has a small plot of land. She's a subsistence farmer, and yes, she's managed to increase productivity on that land. She's rebuilt the soil health. In fact, farmers in Ethiopia looked at it as fattening the soil is what conservation agriculture does. How can we expect her to pay a loan? So these are some of the things that we are actually here to amplify those voices and those interests and those priorities that have already been identified through the long-term relationships and partnerships with civil society. We work in partnership with hundreds and hundreds of community-based organizations who work with their own farmers to lead the development processes. Again, going back to the process for how these funds are mobilized and implemented matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mweni. What I would like to do, I have a few questions that I have received from the audience, virtual audience. So I would like to take a few minutes for us to engage with the audience. And then if there are any questions in the audience as well, you can raise, actually not to raise your hand, but then I think they will pass, no. You could have access to the microphone, and then we'll be able to respond to those questions as well. So, but first, let me go to a question that I have here. Okay, so Okay. What is the role, and I don't know who would want to take this question. So what is the role of men, including young men, in achieving the nexus of between gender inequality and climate change? The role of men in various communities. So who wants to take that?
I think that Satya should respond to that question because he's the man among us and he has great experience. He's a gender champion himself.
Absolutely.
So that he can provide an answer to that question.
Satya, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Maria. Well, I think, in two ways. One is, of course, I personally see that between my generation and the current generation, it's a much more gender equal generation. If you are especially talking about the urban crowd. Now, rural crowd, of course, is a very different place and a very different context. So it's different. But when I see the people working on smart technology, the startup entrepreneurs, the way women and men work together in these environments is extraordinary. And it simply did not exist in my time when I was growing up 40, 50 years ago. And so to that extent, the world has really made some tremendous progress where everything is not seen through a very, very myopic gender lens in which it's a man's lens, basically. It's not even a gender lens. But now I think things have changed quite a bit. But from my personal experience, and I worked until recently when I left as the ASG for UNEP in New York to head the Global Alliance. In my experience, long experience with the UN for more than 2 decades, and primarily in leadership positions, the first office I headed back in the late 90s, the Human Rights Investigations Office in Bosnia, had 1,000 colleagues. So having been part of these very large processes, I have seen that if you really focus on selecting the right people for whatever reasons, and I haven't found an answer to that, you actually find 60 to 70% women in your office. So if it's a question of competence, it isn't. Because if it's a fair selection process, you actually have more than 60, 70% women in the office. Even in the office I was heading, the UNEP office in New York, we had 60, 70% women in that office as well. And the ones that got selected when I was there were all women actually. So the point is that it's not a question of competence. It's a question of creating the right kind of leadership guidance for younger people to work together. So the older generation has a responsibility to not just preach, but practice what we preach. And that just doesn't go to hiring the right kind of people or the right kind of policy, but at the action level, when things are happening on the ground, keeping your eyes and ears open to these distortions that creep in. And as they creep in, they destroy not just what you are trying to do in a meaningful way, but the possible impact that you might have. So I think that's extremely important to be very mindful of the gender challenges, because we live in an unequal world, and don't take anything for granted. Be always on the lookout for these markers. And I think that's a great way to really empowering young women, not just in the conversation, but also in the action.
Thank you. So you did mention to lead by example. So Winnie, I know that you want to come in. Please do so.
Yeah, thank you. So I apologize. The Scaling Up Conservation Agriculture program that we were running actually at the outset did not actively consider the needs and interests of women, the gender aspect. And so thankfully in 2018, Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy came out, and that mandated us to actually revisit the program design and actively and intentionally incorporate gender pieces into the program and streamline it. And so just as an example, in conversations, I mean, I lived and worked in East Africa, and in conversations with the community-based organizations, the majority that they're run by men, we had these conversations about why do we need a gender policy? Why do we need to follow this? Shouldn't we just go to the community and talk to them about gender? And it turned out that actually, and this is the other game changer, that it was working and sitting with the organizations, the representatives in these organizations, the majority of men. If there were women, maybe it was 2 or 3, and they had the administrative roles. So they weren't even in the conversations around programming and planning. So these men, I got to know them, and we had rigorous conversations, and they would ask, well, I mean, if a woman is working for this organization and she gets pregnant halfway in the year, well, I mean, we just have to let her go. And actually easier, just don't hire a woman. So these were the thinking, but we had to create a healthy and safe space for them to raise these issues and for us to have a conversation about why that's not okay. And so by doing that, we actually addressed some of the blind spots when it comes to gender inequality. And we realized, oh, a light went on, a lot of the organizations where they were like, you're right, actually, women work, a lot of the women work a lot more. And as my colleague was saying, there is competency, there is empathy, there is so much more that the organization and the world at large stands to gain by having everybody at the table.
This is a great example of a win-win solution, because when we talk about addressing the blind spots or changing social norms to promote gender equality, there is a tendency to think of the win-lose. Well, with your example, is really understanding how that conversation taking place in the community itself is actually promoting a stronger, more resilient economy where everyone is benefiting from this. I do have a question for you, Winnie, in relations to the video that was shared. It says the video on the, I'm just reading verbatim. So the video on the Ethiopian farm is very encouraging. The couple has improved yield and have a variety which is automatically provided for the family nutrition. Where is this happening in Kenya?
For the question, and I can say in that program, conservation agriculture program in Kenya, we worked in Western Kenya, Central Kenya, and Eastern Kenya, and we worked with thousands, 20,000+ farmers in Kenya who can speak to this. And unfortunately, we didn't create videos of farmers talking about this in Kenya, but we did have face-to-face conversations where we took their information. And if interested, I would be happy to direct our end-line report to share more about some of the results, tangible results that came out of that program in each country. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, please.
Thank you. I don't know. Thank you. Really inspiring session. Incredible stuff. I'm Sian Henley from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm working on a project about how children are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change and do not have nearly as much agency as they ought to in addressing those problems. And it's great to see that your message is very consistent with that, so fully in agreement. But my question is about, in the same way that there's a difference between child's agency or children and women and men, are we also seeing a difference in the agency of boys versus girls? And if so, what can we do to reduce that discrepancy? Thank you.
Thank you. You want to start with that?
I can start.
And then we'll pass it to Maria.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. And I think it's worth reflecting to really understand what the implications and impacts are for the programming that we're doing. Because at the end of the day, these are people's lives. And we're situated in certain cultures, in certain customs. And so we can't really be sort of having an approach where we can helicopter in and do a project and say, well, then, I mean, you guys are okay, but now we have to do this. So I think to your point, I think to me, it highlights how intentional we need to be with including everyone. This has to be an approach that engages everybody, because those boys that maybe they don't have agency or power, they will turn into the men who will be doing the abusing. And so they need to be brought in to understand that, in fact, these girls are their sisters, and they need to be safeguarding and protecting them. And so there's a role for everyone to play. I can stop there and turn it to Maria.
Thank you. Maria, do you want to come in?
Sure, absolutely. I cannot agree more that everyone has a role to play. You know, climate solutions have to be intercultural and intergenerational, and we children, girls, women, men, everybody has a role to play. And I think in terms of the choices we made, in terms of the way our households are organized, but at the same time, yes, children are disproportionately affected by climate impact. And the truth is, a couple of weeks ago, I read an article in The Ecologist talking about climate anxiety among younger generations. And this is so unfair that they have to worry so much about the inability of decision makers, of adults, that we cannot get our act together. I always say that the climate crisis is not the problem, but a symptom of the fractures between society, the economy, and nature, in that we need to mend these rupture of that relationship. So we have the responsibility to make peace with nature in a way, to reconcile the relationship between the way we produce and consume, the way we decide about our future. And when we decide about our future and our present, I was saying rural women, indigenous women should be at the table, but the voices of children are important. And again, just to emphasize that it is so unfair that they are feeling insecure and that they're feeling anxiety because of their climate uncertain future. And here, Nadai, if you allow me, I am right now in Reykjavik at the Women Political Leaders Forum. And unfortunately, I have to run to another venue for an event, but to say that this Gender Day on climate has to remind us that we as women have a very, very important role to play in climate solutions. We have seen, the Ethiopia case, the Guatemala case, but it's happening all over the world. We have a say. We need to be at the table. We need affirmative action in terms of the policies, of the budgeting, everything that we have said. So again, to close, if you allow me, my deepest tribute to rural women that are at the forefront, giving an example of resilience, of innovation, of how to do things well. So greetings, I would say, I cannot speak on behalf of everyone, but of the hundreds of women that are gathering here in Reykjavik, Iceland, to send this very, very strong message to decision makers that are mostly men in Glasgow to say, please do get our act together. We have a responsibility with the current, but also the future generations. So thank you, Nadaya. Thank you to IFAD again, and greetings to all my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Maria. And this is a perfect segue to actually ask also Satya what would be, because now you have the world stage, and the question would be, there is an urgent message that needs to be shared. So what would be your two key priorities that you would like the world to know and to take to heart going forward in response to climate change? Satya, the floor is yours. You have about 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. So the first is that we need to stop lying. If we were at home, our children will be literally killing themselves laughing as to how our parents say lies all the time. Because on the one hand, we are promising we'll be net zero by 2050, 2060, 2070. On the other hand, if you would, the latest UNEP emissions gap report that came out, it is telling us that to be on a path to 1.5 degrees, which is net zero by 2050 or something, we need to be 55% emissions reduction by 2030. What have we promised in writing as countries? 7.5%. So what I am saying and what am I doing? There is no comparison. Now that cannot go on because it doesn't work. I was actually in a conversation, it's a very interesting data by one of the world's leading Earth system scientists who basically pointed out that if you were to go by the promises we made 20 years ago and we didn't keep, if you make an equation out of that, that as to what you promised and what you delivered, and use that for what is now being promised and what is likely to be delivered, then we'll be at 6 degrees Celsius of global warming by the turn of the century, not 3 or 2 or 1.5. And at that, if you translate that to the aviation industry, his point was that equates to 100,000 air crashes a day. That's how bad it is, to present a visual example. So we really need to stop fooling ourselves, stop deluding ourselves, see the problem for what it is, and the poor and the vulnerable will be the worst sufferers. That's the first part. But the second part, there is hope. There's a tremendous opportunity for us to bring together ideas and champions and incubate these ideas, find the resources, make the mistakes we need. We all make mistakes as children, and as we grow up, we turn out to be fine human beings. I don't know what prevents us from making those mistakes as adults. We need to make those mistakes. We need to learn from them pretty quickly. As the futurist Alvin Toffler famously said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those that haven't been to college. It will be those that cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. I think that's the message I want to leave people with. We really need to unlearn and relearn pretty quickly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satya. Moini, you have the floor. Your thoughts.
It's time for action, not words. Developed countries need to deliver the climate finance. I'm looking at my own country, Canada, to deliver that according to the pledge and the promise for the doubling earlier this summer. And I am calling on behalf of my own organization and civil society in Canada and my colleagues that are Canadians here at Glasgow, that we want that climate fund. We want to see that climate finance in the form of at least minimum 50% through adaptation, and in the form of grants, prioritizing small-scale farmers, especially women in least developed countries and small island and developing states. And not all partnerships are equal. So we are committed, and we want to call party leaders, representatives here, colleagues and friends online, to partnerships that foster solidarity, equality, inclusion, accountability, and not just words, but in action. My colleagues earlier talked about action. It's time to act. There's no more time to talk. And to that end, we're here to represent and to bring forward people power. We saw that through the march this weekend. People power is what it's going to take. So it's each one of us collectively and individually driving home that hope that my colleague was talking about.
Thank you so much, Moini. You could not have said better. And actually, we are reaching the end of this conversation, and we actually discussed some very important points, one of which is that the time to act is now. The commitment, there is a sense of urgency. Funds need to flow where it's needed most. The Global South needs to receive the resources, not in the form of loans, but in the form of grants. They are not the ones who have contributed the most to this current situation, but yet they are the ones that are most affected. So grants is what's required. They should be represented at the table of negotiations at all levels. And then we also have to recognize that whether we talk about women, we talk about youth, we talk about indigenous people, they all in their diversity, they are powerful agents of change. We also have to, and then we learned that we should be humbled, given that at times we make mistakes, or when we make commitment and then we reconcile all the different numbers, they may not add up necessarily. So we have to continue to collect evidence so then we can adapt and change our programming in response to the next opportunities. And with this, I would like to thank everyone virtually that has participated to this conversation. I would like to thank the audience also for their participation. And thank you very much. It was my pleasure. And now it's time to say goodbye. Bye-bye. Thank you.